PW officers that it comes from the prisoners who are playing their favorite sport. Another outdoor game is similar to tennis. A racket is long-handled like badminton, and net is high, but those who have watched it compare it with tennis. For indoor sports, officers of the camp point out the German prisoners spend most of their time at chess. And these are what those camp coupons look like. So, I kind of set this up as saying how important the prisoners of war are going to be in the performance of labor. And let me backtrack this for 1 second, because I told you that the first POWs that come to Iowa are Italians, and they came from a camp in Missouri, and that was in 1943. We had a situation with the Italian prisoners of war, however, because in 1943, as you probably know, Benito Mussolini was deposed and executed, and Italy went from being an Axis power to an Allied power. In mid-1943, we found out that we have 30,000 Italian comrades in the United States as prisoners of war. And it's not always a good idea to keep your allies as prisoners of war. So we asked those Italian prisoners, we said, former prisoners, excuse me, we said, we can either ship you back to Italy and you can resume combat, or you can stay in the United States and we'll organize you into what we call Italian service units, and you can travel around to make sure that POW camps are up to spec and ready to go before they open. And most of the Italian POWs chose to do that. And so from 1944 to 1945, we still had 30,000 Italian soldiers, but they were no longer prisoners of war. They were now members of Italian service units. When the camps opened in January of 1944, we had hoped that those German POWs could be used as farm labor to meet the need that many of those Iowa farmers have, as I mentioned before. The problem, however, is that the government bureaucracy, the government regulations did not suit the needs of Iowans. The government regulations specified that if you wanted to use a prisoner of war, you needed to need, sorry for all the needs, 10. You needed to request 10. Well, most Iowa farmers in Page and Kasuth County don't need 10 additional laborers. They need maybe 1 or 2. But because that was the government policy, So in the spring of 1944, as the camp is open and as the spring planting season is nearing, farmers in Page and Fremont counties in the southwest and in Kasuth County were concerned that they weren't going to be able to meet their farm labor needs because the camp policies were too restrictive. And so some of the real heroes of this story were local county agricultural extension agents. And in Page and Fremont County and in Kasuth County, the local agricultural extension agent, who as you probably know, were agricultural educational experts. They helped farmers get access to information that they needed, current up-to-date research on what was and what was not working. Those agricultural extension agents got the brilliant idea to create what they called emergency farm labor associations. And they got farmers to contribute small amounts of money, and then the Agricultural Emergency Labor Association contacted the camp and said, we'd like 30 POWs. And then the farmers would draw POWs from the pool, 1 or 2 or 3 as needed. So before, a farmer couldn't contact the camp and get 1 POW if they needed 1 person to work for them that day, because they had to need 10. And now with these emergency farm labor associations requesting multiple POWs, it seems silly, but it solved the problem. And in the spring of 1944, farmers began relying on German POWs as seasonal and temporary farm laborers. Early on, the requirements were pretty strict, and that meant that a guard had to be within eyeshot of the POW in order for them to work, and eventually that just did not prove to be very effective. Initially, the camp would drive POWs out, and the guard would come to your farm, and the guard would stay there. But within a relatively short period of time, by the summer of 1944, farmers were going to the camp. They were calling ahead and saying, I want Bruno today. And they would go to the camp, and they would park outside the gate, and Bruno would walk out and get in their truck, and they would drive Bruno to their farm, and they would work there. And I use Bruno specifically because Bruno was the name of one particular German POW who worked for the Johnson family in Page County in 1944. And the best way that I could describe how many Iowans responded to German POWs is to say that they developed friendships. And I think that makes sense in many ways. Both in southwestern Iowa and north central Iowa, these are German American communities. I've talked to people who told me that they were speaking German in their Lutheran churches in Kasuth County in the 19 teens. And there were people who could still speak some German, and so some of the German soldiers spoke enough English to communicate, and some of the Iowa farmers were speaking enough German to be able to communicate. And from what I've read and from the people that I've interviewed, many Iowans looked into the eyes of those young German soldiers and saw their brothers and their cousins and their nephews who were American soldiers who were serving overseas as well. And so within a relatively short period of time, pretty strong relationships are going to develop between Iowa farmers and German POWs in particular. To the point where one of my favorite stories is the story of Bruno. Dorothy told me that on one occasion, Bruno came in, he was driving her husband's pickup truck, and he came in from working in the fields and told her husband in broken English that he had seen pheasant and rabbits. And Dorothy's husband said, well, there's a shotgun behind the seat of the pickup truck. Next time you're out there, you should use it, and Bruno did. And that was against camp policy, by the way. If you can imagine a German soldier, a prisoner of war, hunting pheasant in an Iowa farm field in Page County, that is exactly what happened. And Bruno came and worked on the Johnson family farm almost every day in the summer of 1944. And he ate lunch at their table, and he played catch with their kids. And she told me that on one occasion, there was an American guard that came with Bruno, and they were going to eat lunch. And the guard said, I'm not going to sit at the table if that German is going to be sitting here. And so Dorothy said, you can sit outside. And he did. When the war ends, I'm jumping ahead, but I'll come back. When the war ends, we send all the German POWs back home. We had what's called mandatory repatriation, which meant that no, they could not stay because we wanted our soldiers back who were in German POW camps, and we agreed to exchange them. We said, if we want our POWs back, you can have your POWs back. Now, many of those German soldiers do come back to the United States eventually, and I can tell you a couple of stories after a while. But they did have to go home, and when Bruno went home to Germany, Germany was financially devastated. The infrastructure was devastated. You know how much the war was fought in Germany. Bruno wrote back to the Johnsons and said that he and his family were struggling, and so the Johnsons sent him a care package of about $500 to help his family get through hard times. And then Bruno wrote back and thanked them, but said that we were still struggling. So by the time all was said and done, the Johnsons had sent Bruno's family more than $2,000 to help them get through these hard times in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And in the 1980s, a group of German POWs came back to the United States, and they traveled around the state, and they were reunited with a lot of the families that they had worked for. And Bruno was reunited with the Johnson family, and he paid them back $50,000 that they had sent him. And so the short story is that for the majority of the German prisoners of war that lived in Iowa, the relationship that they developed was a positive one. And as a result, that allowed the agricultural labor, the farm labor production, and the farm labor seasons in Iowa to be very successful. I know it's hard to see in the back, I'm sorry, but like I said, I shared this with Margaret. It's perfectly fine if you want to email folks the link to this presentation, but these are German POWs working in Iowa fields. The gentleman on the left is harvesting sugar beets, which have to be harvested by hand, by the way. So when you think about what about farm labor, why is it such a big deal that we have people? Because in Page and Fremont County have more acres of crops like asparagus than any other counties in the state of Iowa. As a matter of fact, Page and Fremont counties in southwestern Iowa, those two counties combined have more acres in nursery than any other two counties in the United States of America. And most of their crops have to be harvested by hand. And that is why the agricultural labor was so incredibly important, was because we're not talking about corn that's going to be used to feed livestock, although that's important too. We're talking about truck crops that are going to be used to feed humans. And I didn't know this until I went to Corinne and gave this presentation, and they educated me, but they were growing table grapes in Page County in 1944, and those grapes were harvested by hand. These are German POWs as well. So the 1944 farm season was incredibly successful, as I had mentioned before, and we were meeting the work administration goals, that they were establishing for us. What we did find is that if you didn't live within 30 miles of one of those two camps, it didn't make any sense to use POW labor. If you had to burn that much gas to get to the camp by the time you got back home, it just was not profitable. And so the commander of the 7th Service Command, who was in charge of all the POW camps in the Midwest, gave camp commanders the authority to establish smaller satellite camps in local communities. And so Camp Algona, this is a map that was on the wall of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell's office in his office at Camp Algona. It shows Algona here, and then each of these squares is a community that has a smaller branch camp. And the smaller branch or satellite camps house between 50 and 200 POWs. And it's hard to see from where you're at, but each one of these squares is a calendar, and the blacked out squares are the months in the calendar where there were POWs in that community. And so some of the Iowa communities that had smaller contingencies of prisoners of war were Storm Lake, Ottawa, Tabor, Shenandoah, Eldora, Toledo, Waverly, Charles City, Clinton, Muscatine, and then a lot of communities in southern Minnesota all the way up to northern Minnesota and South Dakota and North Dakota. And so during the 1944 and 1945 seasons, these smaller groups of POWs would be shipped to those communities and they would live there. So for example, I was just talking to, what was your name? I was talking to Jed. He was from Charles City, and in 1945 in Charles City, there was a group of 80 to 100 German POWs who did work in Charles City, and they stayed in a clubhouse of the local golf course. In Eldora, Iowa, there were a couple of hundred POWs that stayed in an old civilian conservation corps camp on the county fairgrounds near Pine Lake, if you think about Hardin County. As a matter of fact, you can go to Hardin County, you can go to Eldora and to Pine Lake, and they have a building there that is the only building that's standing that I'm aware of where German POWs lived during the Second World War. Remember during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was one of those New Deal programs that employed young men to build roads and to build parks, and they would send a portion of their paycheck back home. They built these camps all across the United States. And when the war broke out and we are pulled out of the Depression, these camps are empty. And so many of the places where these POWs were sent to smaller branch camps were former CCC camps. Although they put barbed wire around. When I gave this talk in Waverly, a gentleman came to me afterwards and told me that when he was young, his parents employed German POWs. His dad was a housing contractor, and he contracted with the U.S. government to use German POWs to help build residential homes in Waverly during the war. And the POWs were supposed to go back to the fairgrounds, but this one German stayed with them for 2 weeks. And that, again, is against state policy, but things like that happen all the time. And I guess there's a part of the story that I forgot to tell you, and that is that in order to have access to prisoner of war labor, you had to try to get American labor first. There were some concerns by local labor unions, as you can imagine, because the misconception was, oh, this is going to be slave labor. You're not going to pay them anything, and well, if you're not going to pay them anything, and they're going to do work for you, then why would you pay an American the going rate? And so the government required that you run an ad in the local newspaper, and that you pay the going rate for labor. And so the going rate for farm labor was 60 cents an hour. And so if you're so when Bruno worked for the Johnsons, they paid the government 60 cents an hour for Bruno's work. And I'm a historian and not a mathematician. The German POWs, they earned 80 cents a day if they worked outside the camp. Remember I told you that they made 10 cents a day if they worked inside the camp. If they agreed to work outside of the camp, they earned 80 cents a day. And so the German soldier makes 80 cents a day, the farmer pays the government 60 cents an hour. And so somebody is making money off the POW labor program, and that's exactly true. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell, the gentleman I was telling you about, the Lieutenant Colonel who was the camp commander at Algona, wrote in his report that he believed that Camp Algona made about $3.5 million for the U.S. government during 1944 and 1945. And of course, the camps didn't run for free. And so the camps did have costs and did have expenses, but the government was making 60 cents an hour and paying the POWs 80 cents a day. Richard Norton, whose father hired German POWs to work on his farm, noted, my father hired a group of them to pull the coffee boards in the bean fields. The garden I discovered when I took some cold soft drinks after them was asleep between the bean rows. Albert Wellhausen said they were mostly good workers, and he considered one in particular the best laborer he had ever employed. And then this is Dorothy about Bruno. Dorothy Johnson recalled an occasion when her husband was forced to leave home and tend to a sick relative, and rather than fear for the welfare of his farm, said, Bruno will know what to do. Bruno was a German POW who spent the better part of a year working for the Johnsons. So I'm going to kind of tie things up here to an end real quick, and then I haven't talked about the Japanese yet, and your rear ends might be getting sore. But I'm going to try to do it. I'll try to do it in 15 minutes, so bear with me. Because things change. The tone changes significantly in January 1945 because the German POWs leave Clarendon and they're replaced by Japanese soldiers. And let me just tell you that if the Clarendons looked into the eyes of German soldiers and saw themselves, they did not look into the eyes of Japanese soldiers and see themselves. And there was a very different kind of relationship between the Japanese and the Clarendons. But what I do want to say is that